This is Section 6, Getting Organized, with Jens Hilke from Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. It's great to be back with you. So in this section, we're really going to get into the steps that you need to take to make sure you have all your ducks in a row as you're moving forward in this process. So the first step is to identify a group to lead. So what group should do that? What group should get to pick the tools that support natural resources? You probably already have groups like the Planning Commission and the Conservation Commission doing a lot of this work. The actions you ultimately pursue will be more successful, though, if you can bring in additional people and perspectives into those set groups. For example, think about also including a cross-section of decision makers. Maybe business owners and property owners who are interested and might provide a different perspective. You can also think about engaging people with skills that will help. A good writer for communication, someone who's comfortable talking to the press or speaking in public, someone who's interested in mapping, and people who can connect you to groups that don't usually make it to public meetings. Last but not least, think about how you can put together an inclusive group that has good interpersonal dynamics. Now, why? Why is it important to identify a specific group? It's important because excitement about taking care of natural resources often starts with a small or specialized group, but you need the ideas and support of a cross-section of the community to be successful. Working to include a broad range of people early on is the way to integrate viewpoints and cooperate from the start, so that you don't end up passing the issue from group to group and having to convince each other. Instead, this allows ideas to be developed together, and that's an important distinction. You can help coordinate and collaborate rather than persuade and convince. That's the important thing here. Once you've formed a good representative group, you'll focus on several things. Assessing community readiness. This is an honest look at what the community is interested in. Identifying needs, desired outcomes, values, and possible actions. Getting a variety of people involved and making sure that your process facilitates collaboration. And seeing it through by identifying actions and ways to complete them. After you've identified a team, the thing you'll do is assess community readiness. This step is a chance to take an honest look at your community's strengths, challenges, leadership, and interests. This affects what you'll tackle and how. It's an exercise in taking stock. So perhaps set up a brainstorming and be sure to take notes on the brainstorm for later reference. These are the type of things that you'll want to look at in that session. Community interest. Are people interested in these issues? Is there energy to tackle them? What else is going on that might affect interest? The timing and the mood really matter here. Okay, think also about where your town has been and acknowledge where these past actions might affect the willingness to do certain things right now. Community capital and assets. What relationships are in place that would help with outreach as you talk about natural resources? Where are there gaps? Assets can also be historical events or shared experiences that are motivating. They're more than just money. Communication culture. Taking action also involves a lot of communication. So you'll want to ask, how does information travel best in your community? Do a lot of people use Front Porch Forum? Is there another specific listserv? Facebook? Do people trust in personal communication from friends more than email blasts or town newsletters? You'll want to make sure that you check these assessments with other community members as you broaden your circle of influence and who's involved in this process. Assessing community readiness gives you an understanding of your context and where you're starting from. Next, you'll look at what you want to accomplish for your natural resources. Now, this may sound obvious, but it's important to start by articulating what the need is. Consider the health of the resource, how it connects to neighboring communities, and what threats there might be. One thing to consider is that sometimes when you become aware of a resource, there's a sense of urgency to take action. But let's check that. What is really needed? Okay, what outcomes do you want to achieve for natural resources? In other words, what do you envision being different when you're done? What are your goals? What exactly does success look like? So this step is important because it gets at why you're taking action, what you want to be different. It's important to be able to articulate this. The what, how you'll do it, comes later. You need to summarize these answers and use for sharing the ideas as the basis for later grant applications, and the town plan is a really good resource in all of this. After you've assessed your community's readiness and identified goals and needs, the next step is to sketch the steps you'll go through to choose the actions. Now, I should mention that an organizing roadmap, what we're talking about here, is not the same as the work plan implement actions. This one summarizes the steps you'll go through to choose the best. So this can be formal, it can be informal, but it's an important process, a part of the process. Even if it's just a list, it helps set a timeline, and importantly, it helps divide up the work, which can help the core members understand their roles and help people from getting burnt out. So that one person isn't responsible for everyone just because they're the only one who knows what the next step is. Why go through this whole getting organized process? It may sound like a little much, especially in a small town. There's a sense that it's pretty easy to know what's going on, where various people stand on different issues, and what it is possible to accomplish. Still, it's worthwhile to examine assumptions during the assessment process, to try and take a fresh look at what the local climate and capacity are, and to get a sense of what's possible. It's also a chance to stop and think about who else can be involved so that you can reach more people before specific solutions are chosen. I'm just going to put this community capital pyramid up again as a reminder that the human and social capital that this work creates are the glue between the natural capital you have and the built elements of where you live. So anyway, in the process of getting organized, you may decide that the best action is to wait. The time may not be right to pursue something like this. For example, if your town has just done something and is burnt out on public participation, might not be the right time. While we hope you agree that the natural resources protection and enhancement can't wait forever, there is something to be said for setting yourself up to succeed by being sensitive to the political scene and the mood of your town. Again, this idea of the interaction between the social capital and the natural capital, how the time needs to be right. Okay, here's the recap of what we just discussed. A suggested process for this step of getting organized. Now, this process doesn't need to take forever, but it's worth taking the time to form a core group and taking the time for an honest assessment of readiness and needs. It can happen in 2 or 3 productive meetings, but it's this critical step for getting other people involved later on if you've clearly articulated what exactly the issue is, what's the need, which is going to help you pinpoint the solution later on. This is also a way to involve people early on. Great. Welcome to Section 7, Essential Skills, Communication and Participation. I want to take a few minutes to provide this overview of communication and participation. Active communication and participation are essential for developing an idea that fits your community and for overall success. The point I want to leave you with is that it involves more than just meetings, and it happens more than just once. The reason to think about communication and participation is because it helps you connect with the people in your community. Real participation is different than the public process that's typically required. what's required? Public hearings, newspaper notices and hearings. How many of you have read that section of the newspaper? At the end of the day, giving notice isn't participation. It's informing someone that something's happening, which is different than a real exchange of information. What can be done instead is to provide multiple and different opportunities to participate early and often. We need creative, new, inclusive ways, intergenerational ways of getting people involved, connected into this issue that you want to move forward. Participation and communication should be woven throughout the process, which is why we suggested including it in the organizing roadmap earlier. Remember, at several different places. There are a lot of good reasons for putting the time and energy into communicating and getting people involved. Connecting with a wide range of people is a way to generate new, more, and better ideas, which will be more likely to be supported than if you just present a single idea to the people. The process of reaching out can help build understanding and support for whatever you're working on. At the same time, you can learn about what the community is interested in and ready for. Communicating about what's happening with your project is also a way to build trust and credibility, and that is essential throughout the process. Successful participation and communication require connecting with a broad range of people, so understanding your community network is important. Identifying who's in your town and how they are connected allows you to think about the best ways to reach those groups, especially groups that don't usually participate. Low-income people, parents, seniors with limited mobility. All of these groups can be difficult to connect with in traditional circles. So start by brainstorming what groups there are in your community. This is something the core team can do. Once identified, you can use the network to brainstorm and identify any gaps in your core team. Then expand the core team. Invite more people to participate from those groups. You can use people in the network to help verify your assessment of community readiness to make sure you're on the right track. You can ask for their help in spreading the word about your outreach events. Always ask, who else do you think we should talk to? Even people who don't think they're networked know a lot about the community. Now, email is good, but the phone is better. Those interpersonal connections really matter that you'll develop. Now, I want you to think broadly. I want you to think outside the box of these traditional relationships. In Hubbardton, Vermont, the Hubbardton Battlefield Association became a champion for wildlife when it incorporated wildlife into the property's management plan and promoted wildlife-related educational programming at the historic site. Now, that is an unlikely alliance, and that's thinking outside the box in terms of how outreach can get to different groups in new ways. That's what we're talking about here. As you're thinking about outreach, community networks, it's also useful to think about what motivates people to get involved. Why would anyone want to sit through your meetings? People want to make a difference. They want to know that their efforts won't be wasted. They want to be part of a successful enterprise. They want to see concrete results. They want to forge relationships with their neighbors, and they want to learn and be challenged. As you can see, it's not just that people want to let their opinions be known. In general, people want to make a difference or a connection or both. Now, think about how your engagement process answers these different needs. If it doesn't, what might you want to change? How do you make this more interesting, more appealing to give people what it is that they want when they're volunteering? To reach the people identified in your network, you're going to need a range of different approaches. I'd like to start by talking about one approach in particular, celebrating where you live, celebrating your place. People's connection to where they live is extremely powerful. Activities that connect people to that place or celebrate things about it are a great first step for generating interest in what you're doing. Celebrating place also helps people identify or confirm shared values. They're part of the same team. It's also a way to reach out beyond the choir of people who are involved in one particular natural resource issue and find commonality through this celebration of this mutual interest. Another benefit of doing this is that it emphasizes this commonality. All too often, it's easy for discussions about change to become about us and them and a strategy for getting to them. But instead, start sharing your place and seeing what values people commonly enjoy. What can celebrating involve? Well, guided tours or outing, a walks and talks series. New Haven, Vermont has an armchair naturalist series. The Middletown Springs had walks in the town forest. You can have events. Always have food if you can. Potlucks are great. Do photo contests. Whatever you can to have fun. On screen at the top right is a river trip that the Science to Action Project did to celebrate the Winooski as a common feature in the landscape where they were working. There are great ideas here for celebrating place. Next, you want to think about how to connect with people. Now, there are many ways to get the word out and gather input, from traditional approaches like meetings and surveys to more outside-the-box ideas like photography contests or chalkboards around town that pose a question. Now, we had already talked about the community network as a starting place for figuring out how all these different groups that are in your town. Now you want to think about how to reach these different groups. Web and email outreach, social media. Now, this can be great for getting the word out, but it isn't always the best way to solicit input. You could use old media like postal mail and newsletters, newspapers, radio, do webinars, focus groups, surveys, meetings, talking to people, hands-on activities like mapping and charrettes. Now, these are just a few ideas. You can see a helpful summary of the different approaches in the Vermont Planning Manual on the resource page. There are a variety of options out there for how you can connect with people. There's a lot to be said for meeting people where they are, from different parts of town, from different economic and political backgrounds. Here are just some examples that set up a table at the transfer station on a Saturday morning and do Dunkin' Donuts. You could have volunteers taking turns hanging out at the local store or gas station to meet with people as they come in the morning. Farmers markets. You could set up at the farmers market, talking to residents and newcomers alike. And of course, there are all manner of existing school organizations, faith groups, clubs. So next, I'll give you some more specific examples from other Vermont towns. The first participation success story is from Bethel. That's in Windsor County, and here's what they did. Tropical Storm Irene severely damaged roads and buildings. It was a reminder that development in the river corridor was extremely dangerous and costly. There was interest in prohibiting more development there, but there was also sensitivity about regulations that could affect private property rights. Community leaders worked with community members and the Regional Planning Commission to figure out what this would look like. Work was funded by a state municipal planning grant. Here's how they did it. The process follows. The Regional Planning Commission staff made a GIS map showing where a building would be prohibited if it were within the river corridor regulations. It showed 11 parcels. With the available GIS map information, Bethel planners held a forum to discuss river corridor regulations. In addition to landowners, invitees included listers, planning commission members, select board members. The group used these maps and their local knowledge and determined that most of the parcels were either unbuildable because of slope or whatever, or had buildable land outside the corridor. They found only one parcel where regulations would prohibit building. So how did this project in Bethel help? Well, this regulation will mean that the river has more room to move without property and people being harmed. Existing buildings are grandfathered in. The town will save money in the long term through the Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, ERAF, since having river corridor regulations means that the state will pay part of the town's FEMA match for future disasters. That's FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. The town actually compared scenarios, and they found that if they'd had the river corridor regulations when Tropical Storm Irene had hit, the town's share for the disaster would have been $300,000 less than what they had to pay. On our resources page, we have a link for more information about this. This process is a model for other towns considering river corridor regulations. In terms of lessons learned, using a map combined with local expertise, especially listers, helped. It integrated local knowledge and helped people learn about their options. The process gave the town a realistic view of the impact of regulation through comparing those different scenarios, which helped them decide that it would be an appropriate strategy. If they found that 50 properties would have been affected, they might have approached it differently. The information and the context helped shape the solution. Also, their co-benefits. The assistant town manager calculated how much the town could save after disasters if their match obligation for FEMA funding was lower. It helped to have multiple reasons to adopt the regulation, including saving money. So thinking through the different scenarios helped understand the impacts of the proposed change. Okay, here's another case study from Brandon. Let me just tell you a little bit about the community. Brandon is a medium-sized Vermont town with a village. It's adjacent to a large swath of conserved land, and the town includes forested areas that are important for wildlife connectivity. The town was hit hard by Tropical Storm Irene in 2011. The town is supportive of planning and has had past successes with natural resource protection, and it takes a measured approach to regulation. Here's what they did. A team, including conservation organizations, biologists, and staff from the Agency of Natural Resources, worked with landowners on educational outreach, and then later worked with the town's planning commission. It was part of an outreach effort to connect with towns where important wildlife connectors were located. So, citizens and the planning commission were enthusiastic about protecting the wildlife corridor and wanted to take steps to protect local forest resources so that the connection could be maintained. Here's how they did it. The project started with outreach and education by the biologist about the wildlife corridor. This included a well-attended series of walks and talks, wildlife tracking, and collaboration with the local wildlife group. It provided many opportunities to talk about wildlife connectivity and how the town's resources related to the surrounding area. It was a successful outreach effort that reached landowners near the corridor. Due to a change in the project, the focus shifted to the Planning Commission, partly because of the expertise available. This assistance involved meetings with the Planning Commission to talk about different approaches, mostly via zoning updates, to protecting the wildlife corridor. There was also a public meeting on a Saturday morning that had hands-on activities to get ideas about the solutions. The Planning Commission decided to update the zoning to protect the wildlife corridor. However, when they had a hearing, people turned out to speak against the change. They were concerned about their property values and whether the science was valid and whether it could hurt the town's fragile state after Irene. Even after a follow-up meeting to answer people's questions and concerns, people remained skeptical. The zoning did not advance. So, what were the project outcomes? Well, a new Planning Commission member did get involved out of concern about this type of zoning. Talking about forests and wildlife is now pretty challenging in town, but the community does remain supportive of protecting water resources. The Planning Commission had tried hard to advance what they felt was a good idea using the resources that they had, but then found the community's reaction somewhat discouraging. It may affect the willingness to accept outside help in the future if there was a sense that it was not well coordinated. In terms of lessons learned, it's necessary to unify related efforts within one location. The town had an interest in the issues and willingness to act, but the various outreach and planning efforts were not as well coordinated as they could have. As a result, though the Planning Commission made efforts to solicit ideas from residents and truly cared about not ultimately come from a broad cross-section of community members or harness the energy of the previous efforts of expertise. Outside technical assistance providers can suggest solutions that work extremely well in some situations and in some places. As local officials, you need to bear in mind that solutions work best when the local leaders carefully examine and get behind the ones that seem the best fit and make them the community's own. If you're an expert providing technical assistance to a town, you'll be the one with that specialized information. If the town is obvious, it's easier to over-promote this without realizing it. Be aware of the community. Lastly, continuity matters. Organizations and town committees all change structure as creating work plans and documenting reasons for moving forward with decisions can create continuity. When continuity is lacking, changes can lead to mixed messages and impact relationships. Organizations working with towns should remember this and make effort. This is just one point in time in one town. It happens all over the place, and these are all intermixed with other successful efforts. It's all part of the process of moving forward.